Kelly's World Season 1 Review, Episode 2: The Birth of the Global System, Expansion, Exchange, and Inequality. This episode examines the emergence of a global system around 1450, driven by technological innovation and expanding trade networks. It begins by analyzing the unique development of civilizations in the Americas and their vulnerability due to isolation. The episode then explores the global shift from land-based to maritime trade, emphasizing the rise of European expansion and the decline of earlier systems. It also examines the formation of a global economy through trade, conquest, and the Columbian Exchange. Finally, the episode considers how European transformation, colonization in Latin America, and the Atlantic slave trade integrated different regions into a global system, often reinforcing inequality and economic dependency. Episode 8: The Americas Before 1450, Development in Isolation. Before 1450, the civilizations of the Americas developed in relative isolation from the rest of the world. This isolation had a profound impact on their political, economic, and technological development. While societies such as the Aztec and Inca achieved impressive levels of organization and innovation, their separation from Afro-Eurasian civilizations limited the exchange of ideas, technologies, and resources. As a result, the Americas provide an important example of how geographic isolation can shape the trajectory of development. Geography played a central role in this isolation. The vast oceans separating the Americas from Europe, Africa, and Asia prevented sustained contact between these regions. Within the Americas themselves, geographic features also pose challenges. The north-south orientation of the continents created a wide range of climates and environments, making it difficult for crops, animals, and technologies to spread easily across regions. This contrasts with the east-west orientation of Eurasia, where similar climates facilitated the movement of agricultural practices and innovations. Despite these limitations, American civilizations developed complex and sophisticated societies. The Aztec Empire, centered in present-day Mexico, built a powerful political system based on tribute and military conquest. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, was a large and well-organized city, demonstrating advanced urban planning and engineering. Similarly, the Inca Empire in South America created an extensive network of roads and a highly centralized system of governance that allowed them to control a vast and diverse territory. Agriculture was a key foundation of these societies. American civilizations developed important crops such as maize, potatoes, and cacao, which supported large populations. Techniques such as terrace farming and irrigation allowed them to adapt to challenging environments. However, the absence of large domesticated animals such as horses or oxen limited transportation and agricultural productivity. This made it more difficult to move goods and people efficiently compared to Afro-Eurasian societies. Another important difference was the limited use of writing systems. While the Maya developed a sophisticated form of writing, many other societies relied on oral traditions or alternative methods of record-keeping, such as the Inca use of quipu. Without widely used written language, the ability to preserve and transmit complex knowledge over long periods was more constrained. Political structures in the Americas often relied heavily on military power and control over subject populations. In the case of the Aztecs, conquered peoples were required to pay tribute, which helped sustain the empire. However, this system also created resentment among subject groups, weakening internal cohesion. In conclusion, the civilizations of the Americas demonstrate both the strengths and limitations of development in isolation. While they achieved remarkable advancements in governance, agriculture, and engineering, geographic and technological constraints limited broader connectivity. These factors would later play a significant role when contact with Europeans occurred, leading to rapid and dramatic changes. Episode 9: Global Power Shifts Around 1450, From Land to sea. Around 1450, the global balance of power began to shift in significant ways, marking the transition from a primarily regional world to one that was increasingly interconnected. This period represents a turning point in world history, as older systems based on land-based trade began to decline, and new maritime networks emerged. These changes were driven by a combination of political decisions, technological advancements, and shifting economic priorities. For centuries, long-distance trade had been dominated by overland routes such as the Silk Road. These networks connected East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. However, the effectiveness of these routes depended on political stability. The Mongol Empire had provided this stability during the period known as the Pax Mongolica, but as Mongol power declined, these routes became less secure and less efficient. At the same time, attention began to shift toward maritime trade. The Indian Ocean had long supported a vibrant trading system connecting East Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Unlike land-based trade, maritime routes could carry larger quantities of goods more efficiently, making them increasingly attractive for merchants and states seeking economic growth. A critical factor in this global shift was the decision by China to withdraw from large-scale maritime exploration. During the early 15th century, the Ming dynasty sponsored a series of voyages led by Cheng He, demonstrating China's advanced naval capabilities. However, these expeditions were eventually halted due to changing political priorities. The Chinese government chose to focus on internal stability and defense rather than external expansion. This withdrawal had significant consequences. By stepping back from maritime exploration, China created an opportunity for other powers to expand into global trade networks. European states, in particular, would later take advantage of this gap. At the same time, Europe was undergoing important changes that positioned it for expansion. Although still politically fragmented, many European states were becoming more centralized. Monarchs were gaining greater control over taxation and military organization, allowing them to fund overseas exploration. In addition, competition among European states encouraged innovation and expansion, as each sought to gain an advantage over the others. Technological developments also played a key role. Improvements in ship design, navigation, and mapping made long-distance sea travel more feasible. These advances allowed European sailors to explore new routes and establish connections with distant regions. In conclusion, the period around 1450 marks a major transition in global history. The decline of land-based trade networks, combined with the rise of maritime routes, reshaped patterns of interaction. Decisions made by major powers, particularly China's withdrawal from exploration and Europe's increasing engagement, helped shift the center of global activity toward the seas. These changes laid the foundation for the expansion of global trade and the emergence of a more interconnected world. Episode 10: The Rise of the Global Economy, Trade, Technology, and Exchange. After 1450, the world entered a new phase of economic development characterized by increasing global interconnection. The emergence of a global economy was driven by technological innovation, expanding trade networks, and the growing involvement of states in economic activity. While earlier systems of exchange had connected regions, this period marked the beginning of sustained, large-scale interaction between previously isolated parts of the world. One of the key drivers of this transformation was the development of new maritime technologies. Improvements in ship design, such as stronger hulls and more flexible sails, allowed vessels to travel longer distance and navigate more challenging waters. Navigational tools like the compass and advancements in map-making made it easier for sailors to determine their position and plan routes. These innovations reduced the risks associated with ocean travel and made long-distance trade more reliable. European powers played a central role in expanding global trade networks. Unlike earlier trading systems that relied primarily on cooperation, European expansion often involved the use of military force. Armed ships and fortified trading posts allowed European states to control key ports and trade routes. This gave them a significant advantage over existing networks, particularly in the Indian Ocean, where they inserted themselves into established systems of exchange. European organization also evolved during this period. Joint stock companies became an important mechanism for financing trade and exploration. These companies allowed multiple investors to pool resources and share risks, making it possible to undertake large and expensive ventures. In many cases, governments supported these companies, linking economic activity with state power. One of the most significant aspects of the emerging global economy was the Columbian Exchange. This term refers to the widespread transfer of plants, animals, people, and diseases between the Americas and Afro-Eurasia following European contact. The effects of this exchange were profound and far-reaching. In the Americas, the introduction of diseases such as smallpox had devastating consequences for indigenous populations, who had no prior exposure and therefore little immunity. Population declines weakened existing societies and made it easier for Europeans to establish control. At the same time, new animals such as horses transformed transportation and agriculture in the Americas. In Afro-Eurasia, crops from the Americas, such as maize and potatoes, contributed to population growth by providing reliable and nutritious food sources. These crops could be grown in a variety of environments, increasing agricultural productivity and supporting larger populations. Despite these benefits, the global economy that emerged was highly unequal. European powers often extracted resources from colonies and used them to support economic growth at home. Colonized regions were typically structured to produce raw materials rather than develop independent economies, reinforcing patterns of dependency. In conclusion, the rise of the global economy after 1450 marked a major shift in world history. Technological innovation, expanding trade networks, and the Columbian Exchange connected distant regions in new ways. However, these connections were not equal, and the global system that emerged was shaped by power, exploitation, and economic imbalance. Episode 11: European Transformation, Renaissance, Reformation, and State Building. Between 1450 and 1750, Europe underwent a series of major cultural, intellectual, and political transformations that reshaped its internal structure and prepared it for a more prominent role in global affairs. These changes, most notably the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the rise of centralized states, altered how Europeans understood authority, knowledge, and governance. Together, they contributed to the emergence of a more dynamic and outward-looking society. The Renaissance, which began in Italy and spread across Europe, marked a revival of interest in classical Greek and Roman ideas. It emphasized human potential, creativity, and intellectual inquiry, a perspective often referred to as humanism. This shift encouraged scholars and artists to focus not only on religious subjects, but also on the study of history, literature, and the natural world. The Renaissance did not reject religion, but it broadened the scope of intellectual life and promised new ways of thinking. A key development that supported these changes was the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century. The printing press made it possible to produce books more quickly and at lower cost, significantly increasing access to written material. Ideas could now spread more widely and rapidly than ever before. This expansion of literacy and information played a crucial role in shaping both cultural and religious developments. One of the most important consequences of this increased circulation of ideas was the Protestant Reformation. Beginning in the early 16th century, reformers such as Martin Luther challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, criticizing practices such as the sale of indulgences and calling for a return to what they saw as more authentic religious principles. These challenges led to the creation of new Protestant denominations and permanently divided Christianity in Europe. The Reformation had significant political as well as religious consequences. Rulers often adopted Protestantism as a way to assert independence from the authority of the Catholic Church. This contributed to the strengthening of state power, as monarchs gained greater control over religious institutions within their territories. At the same time, religious conflict became widespread, culminating in wars such as the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. The conclusion of these conflicts led to important changes in the organization of European politics. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 established the principle of state sovereignty, meaning that rulers had the authority to govern their territories without external interference. This marked a significant turn toward the modern system of nation-states. In addition to these religious and political changes, European states became more centralized. Monarchs developed more effective systems of taxation, administration, and military organization. This increased their ability to project power both within their borders and abroad. Competition among these states further encouraged expansion and innovation. In conclusion, the transformation of Europe between 1450 and 1750 created the conditions for its growing influence in global affairs. The Renaissance expanded intellectual horizons, the Reformation reshaped religious and political authority, and the rise of centralized states strengthened governance. Together, these developments helped position Europe as a key driver of global change in the centuries that followed. Episode 12: Early Latin America: Colonization, Labor Systems, and Inequality. Following European contact with the Americas after 1492, a new colonial system emerged that fundamentally reshaped the region. European powers, particularly Spain and Portugal, established control over vast territories and reorganized societies to serve their economic interests. This process introduced new political structures, labor systems, and social hierarchies that would have long-lasting effects on Latin America. While the region became an important part of the emerging global economy, it did so in a way that emphasized extraction and inequality. One of the primary goals of European colonization was the extraction of wealth. Valuable resources such as gold and silver were taken from the Americas and sent to Europe, contributing to economic growth there. To support this system, colonial authorities needed a reliable source of labor. Early on, they turned to indigenous populations, implementing systems such as the encomienda. The encomienda system granted Spanish settlers the right to demand labor and tribute from indigenous communities. In theory, this system required colonists to provide protection and religious instruction in return. In practice, however, it often resulted in harsh and exploitative conditions. Indigenous populations were forced to work in mines and on plantations, leading to widespread suffering and population decline. The decline was further intensified by the spread of diseases such as smallpox, which had devastating effects on population with no prior exposure. As indigenous labor became less available, European colonists increasingly turned to enslaved Africans to meet labor demands. This shift contributed to the growth of the Atlantic slave trade and further integrated the Americas into the global economy. Colonial societies in Latin America were highly stratified. Social status was closely tied to race and place of birth. At the top of the hierarchy were peninsulares, individuals born in Europe who held the highest political positions. Below them were Creoles, people of European descent born in the Americas, who often controlled land and wealth but had less political power. Mixed-race populations, along with indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, occupied lower positions in the social hierarchy. The rigid social structure reinforced inequality and limited social mobility. Economic systems were also designed to benefit European powers rather than promote balanced development within the colonies. Most colonies focused on producing raw materials for export, such as sugar, silver, and agricultural products. This created a pattern of economic dependency that persisted long after independence. Despite these constraints, colonial Latin America was also a site of cultural exchange. European, indigenous, and African traditions interacted, creating new cultural forms in language, religion, and daily life. However, this blending occurred within a context of inequality and coercion. In conclusion, early Latin America was shaped by colonization in ways that emphasized extraction, labor exploitation, and social hierarchy. While the region became an integral part of the global economy, it did so under conditions that reinforced inequality and dependency. These patterns would have lasting consequences for the region's political and economic development. Episode 13: Africa and the Atlantic Slave Trade: Integration through Exploitation. Between 1450 and 1750, Africa became increasingly integrated into the emerging global system, largely through the Atlantic slave trade. While Africa had long been connected to regional and trans-Saharan trade networks, the scale and nature of its participation in global trade changed dramatically during this period. The demand for labor in the Americas transformed existing systems of slavery and had profound social, economic, and political consequences for African societies. It is important to recognize that forms of slavery existed in Africa prior to European involvement. In many cases, enslaved individuals were prisoners of war or people who had fallen into debt. However, these systems were typically smaller in scale and often allowed some degree of social mobility. Enslaved individuals could sometimes integrate into society over time, and slavery was not based on rigid racial categories. The Atlantic slave trade differed significantly from these earlier systems. European demand for labor in the Americas, particularly for plantation agriculture, created a large and sustained market for enslaved people. Crops such as sugar, tobacco, and later cotton required intensive labor, and European colonists turned to Africa as a primary source of that labor. European traders established coastal trading posts and worked with African intermediaries to obtain enslaved individuals. African leaders and merchants often participated in this system, capturing people through warfare or raids and trading them in exchange for goods such as firearms, textiles, and alcohol. This participation was influenced by economic incentives, but it is important to note that European demand was the driving force behind the expansion of the trade. The scale of the Atlantic slave trade was unprecedented. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean in what is known as the Middle Passage. Conditions during this journey were extremely harsh, with overcrowding, disease, and abuse leading to high mortality rates. Those who survived were sold into slavery in the Americas, where they were forced to work under brutal conditions. The impact of the slave trade on African societies was significant and long-lasting. The demand for enslaved people contributed to increased warfare and instability, as groups sought to capture individuals for trade. This disrupted existing political systems and weakened some regions. Population loss was another major consequence. The removal of millions of people, particularly young and able-bodied individuals, affected economic productivity and demographic patterns. In some areas, this contributed to long-term economic challenges. At the same time, some African states grew more powerful by participating in the slave trade. Access to European goods, especially firearms, allowed these states to expand their influence. However, this growth was often tied to continued participation in the trade, creating a cycle of dependency and conflict. In conclusion, Africa's integration into the global economy during this period was shaped by the Atlantic slave trade. While it created new economic connections, It did so through a system of exploitation that had devastating human and societal consequences.